Board of Education regular meeting Wednesday, October the 18th, 2023 at 7 p.m. We would stand, salute the flag, and a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Recommend to amend tonight's agenda to include item 10E, nutrition services adult meal price.
Second.
Okay, first, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approving tonight's agenda as amended.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
Mr. Lee?
Approved.
Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the approval of the minutes of the Board of Education regular meeting of September the 20th, 2023.
So moved. Second.
First, Mr. Nichols. Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
And Mr. Lee?
Abstain.
Abstain. Okay, and I approve. Recommend the approval of the minutes of the Board of Education student disciplinary hearing of September 27th,
So moved.
2023. It's Mr. Nichols?
Second.
Mrs. Pugh, I also approve. Okay, well, approve. Mr. Nichols, Mrs. Pugh,
Approved.
Mr. Lee,
Abstain.
abstain, and I approve. We have no guests this evening.
No more participation.
Board participation, the only thing that I want to say is we have Powder Puff game that will be coming up this Wednesday night. Oh, we have NAILA tomorrow night, Fall Fest. If I missed something, let me know. Powder Puff game is Wednesday night. Friday night is the parade. Saturday is homecoming. There's a lot of vendors that's going to be out here too. And the hockey game, the alumni hockey game, and homecoming. Pop Warner, yeah. A lot of games. A lot going on this next week in each one of the schools. Public participation, no one signed up. Financial report.
Tina gets it now.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Be real quick tonight. So our accomplishments since last time we met, we had our September 30th unit count. It's been completed. It's not been certified yet, but our enrollment has decreased by 69 students overall, but our units have actually increased by 2.38. Our utilization of units and positions, we are working on finalizing that. And our funds that are expiring on September 30th have all been spent. And also our federal grant funds, the requirements were to have so much of it encumbered, and we have done that, so we won't lose any funds. Some things that are still upcoming, our local funds audit for FY22, we still have not received the final report yet, but we do have a new audit starting on Monday. That is for the FY22 and 23 unit count and authorized positions audit. So auditors will be on site Monday next week. Our mental health staff report will be due to DOE on November 17th. And we're getting close to having our FY23 MCI funds spent. So we'll be getting our enhanced MCI allocation here soon. And our Filter First funds, we have a plan for usage due to DOE by January 1st. And here is just a snapshot of our reserve and local fund, updated for the current month as compared to the trend from last year. So do you have any questions?
I just have a quick one. Can you help me out here? You said enrollment decreased by 69, but units increased?
Yes, so our units are basically weighted based on the needs of the students.
Okay, okay. I get it. Just need some clarification.
Right.
Thank you. Okay, unfinished business, second reading. Policy IK, academic achievement recognition, recommend the second reading of policy IK, academic achievement recognition as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee, roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Lee.
Approve.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. School choice, recommend approval of school choice as a group.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols. Second, Mrs. Pugh, roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh. And Mr. Lee.
Approve.
So approved. Recommend approval of school choice as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols. Second, Mrs. Pugh, roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Lee.
Approve.
So approved. Fundraisers, recommend approval of fundraisers as a group.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee, roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of fundraisers as submitted.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee, roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. No rentals, no trips. Recommend approval of nutrition services, adult meal price, proposed increase as submitted.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. The first reading, policy IKA-R1, grading system regulation for newcomers and multilingual learners. I said that right? Recommend first reading of policy IKA-R1, grading system regulation for newcomers and multilingual learners as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy will be available for review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website. Community input is welcome and should be directed to the superintendent of schools no later than Tuesday, November the 14th, 2023. Possible executive session items. Personnel, professional, recommend to approve the personnel report of, approve the personnel recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment A.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee, roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment B, support. Recommend to approve the personnel report of recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment B.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approve.
And Mrs. Pugh. So approved. Personnel attachment C, coaches. Recommend to approve the personnel report of recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment C.
So moved.
First, Mr. Lee, second, Mr. Nichols, roll call vote, Mr. Lee,
Approve.
Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
and Mrs. Pugh. So approved. Personnel attachment D, cafe, recommend to approve the personnel report of recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment D.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee, roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh, Mr. Lee,
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Okay, future agenda items, the next regular board meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, November the 18th at 7 p.m. at Law Middle School Cafe right here. Do I have a motion? We adjourn.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh, and Mr. Lee.
Approve.
So approved, so we are adjourning at 7:09 p.m.
Is that a record?
That might be a record.
That might be a record, or it might